At Beyond Four Walls, we believe everyone deserves to feel safe, especially when working alone. That's why we support the Holly Gazard Trust and their personal safety app, Holly Guard Extra. With a simple shake or tap, the app raises an alert, instantly sharing your location and recording audio and video, capturing vital evidence. The alert is sent to a police-approved contact centre, where trained professionals take action on your behalf and send support directly to your location. Stay safe, stay protected. Visit hollyguard.com to learn more.
Welcome to a very special episode of Beyond Four Walls with the DALA Group and Archway Facade Management. I'm Jodie Fraser and I'm very pleased to welcome some very special guests with me today. Steve, would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, hi Jodie, nice to meet you. I'm Steve Rees. I'm a chartered construction manager. I've got 25 years experience delivering complex construction projects in the UK. I'm managing director of DALA Projects, and we are a specialist lead consultancy practice that specialise in UK remediation projects. So basically, we help guide the clients on the journey, right from initial FRAEW investigation reports, right through construction management and compliance.
Fantastic. And Phil?
Hi, good morning, Jodie. Yes, Philip Mallon, director at Archway Facade Management. Archway specialise in the applicant's rep role with the Cladding Safety Scheme. We liaise closely with the professional team to arrange funding and guide the RTM through the complex Cladding Safety Scheme sort of facade remediation process.
Fantastic. And Jonathan?
Hi, thanks, Jodie. It's great to be back on Beyond Four Walls. First of all, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jonathan Channing. I've worked in residential block management since the 1990s, mostly on the managing agent side. And today I run JC Property Consultancy. My work sits between leaseholders, RMCs, RTMs, managing agents, freeholders, and specialist industry partners, such as Archway and DALA. But often, particularly when things get complicated, and that often means building safety, but sometimes insurance and staffing and major works and that sort of thing. A big part of what I do is supporting leaseholder groups and their directors, who often find themselves dealing with highly technical issues, such as the ones we're going to discuss, issues that they never expected when they bought their homes, whilst also working closely with agents and sector experts to help sort of bridge knowledge gaps and improve outcomes. This subject today really matters to me because cladding remediation is far more than construction. It's about resident safety, communication, governance, making sure people are properly supported through what can be an incredibly daunting process. So I'm coming at this from a few angles: a long-standing property management experience, hands-on work with leaseholder groups, and a sort of broader consultancy perspective focused on connecting the right people, expertise, and strategy to get better results.
So for someone who's sat on a resident management company board, who's been told their building needs to be remediated, they've got all of these worries going through their head. Can you walk us through the main milestones from, the FRAEW report to completed works?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jodie, and something that we come up against sort of week in, week out. So generally what happens is either an insurance company or an insurance company or perhaps a conveyancing solicitor will request a copy of a fire risk assessment of the external wall, or a FRAEW as we call it. Then generally what will happen is the management company will ask a fire engineer to undertake the FRAEW. And if it's a very bad day at the office and it's a B2, suddenly there'll be a bit of blind panic amongst the leaseholders and the RTM. And that sort of blind panic is from increased insurance costs right through not being able to sell their leasehold flat. Archway specialise in sort of sitting in the leaseholder chair or the RTM chair, the directors. We look to then, we'll get a copy of the FRAEW, we'll review it internally. We'll then look at what avenues we can do in terms of funding. 99% of our work is done through the Cladding Safety Scheme, which is a government-funded remediation fund for buildings in excess of 11 metres, and that provide specialist grant funding for the remediation of defects within the external wall. Once we know it's eligible, we'll then look to make an application. As part of that application, there is sort of various due diligence hurdles that Archway, together with the RTM, will look to cross. Everything from sort of title plans right through to the composition of the RTM, because sometimes you can get a right to manage company, sometimes you get just general management companies, or they're just a leasehold collective, and then we need to speak direct with the freeholder to get their consent to make the application. As part of that process, then, once the building is deemed eligible, I will then look to sort of coordinate the sort of overall strategy in terms of procurement. So I'll liaise with my good friends at the DALA group who act as lead consultant. I suppose, Steve, that's a really nice time for you to jump in and sort of give us an overview on DALA and the services you provide in terms of that lead consultancy route.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Phil. So DALA projects would then step in and kind of take the lead in terms of the technical development of the pre-construction phase, basically. So what that would entail was basically we would look at taking the FRAEW report, looking at the information that's contained within that, and then developing a technical specification for the project. That would then go into the tender docs, the pack of tender documentation, which would be used to go out for competitive tender in the main contracting market. Once we receive the tenders back, we would then analyse those, negotiate those, and position it, finalise the costs for a tender award. So we would then choose a main contractor that's going to be delivering the construction phase of the project. And then we would move into a stage which we call the pre-contract service agreement, where the contractor would be able to do some intrusive inspections on the building and get the information they need to populate their full detailed construction design for the project. And then that's what helps us drill down and finalise the final cost submission to the CSS for funding approval. Then once funding approval is kind of received, we then enter a period of negotiation of contract amendments, position the RTM or RMC with the main contractor in terms of administering a JCT design and build contract. And then we move forward to mobilisation, boots on the ground, getting the work completed on site, right the way through to full construction management and compliance. So the final objective obviously being an EWS 1 certificate, which means the building's compliant and insurable.
And I suppose if I jump in there just to sort of dovetail how the leaseholders, the RMTs, sort of sit pari passu with the project team and Archway. So throughout the process, we do a fortnightly Teams call with the directors or the leaseholders. We provide monthly correspondence in terms of a newsletter, just to let them know where we are in the process. And likewise, they also have access to the team members at Archway's direct telephone numbers and emails. But it's just one of the key sort of, I suppose, key milestones or performance indicators that the Cladding Safety Scheme look to do is continuous education and communication throughout the project. That's introducing the various team members. So the whole way through the process, which Steve has just explained, there's a minimum of monthly correspondence the whole way through and communication. I know Steve and I are working on quite a big project down in Brighton, and we've just got to site. We got to site sort of 12 weeks early. Steve, was it?
Yeah.
12 weeks early. So Steve drove the program, the tender program. We weren't supposed to start on site till June. We sort of collaboratively sat down as a project team in December. We realized that there was an opportunity for us to bring the project forward 12 weeks. We then sat with the RTM, the directors. They were happy with that. And thankfully, we started on site mid-March. We had our first site meeting, which all the directors at the RTM sat in as well. So that's sort of an example of the communication and how the RTM are involved the whole way through, from a sort of a high level right through to technical.
That's great that you're so passionate as well about communicating with them, because I think that, you know, one of the biggest complaints that the ombudsman receive, as an example, is due to lack of communication. If you're dealing with somebody's home and you're dealing with the fact that, you know, you're pulling all of this material off of their building, and then you just expect them to just, oh, you know, we're dealing with this and we're not going to communicate with you. I think it's really great that you do that.
So I've got a vested interest because I live in a flat in North London, and my landlord is well, how can I say they're
not a communicator, clearly.
Not great at communication. So it's a bit of a passion point from my perspective, because I know how, having dealt with hundreds of leaseholders to date now, you know, a lot of these guys were originally first-time buyers that, say, purchased their flat in circa 2016, 2017. I know of one couple that we're dealing with in Stevenage. They purchased the flat in 2016. They bought a one-bed flat, first-time buyers. They're now, obviously, they got caught within the cladding. They're now husband and wife, 2 kids still living in a one-bed flat, and they're unable to sell. Lucky enough, we will get to the point where they'll be able to sell probably at the end of this year. I know there is mortgage products now on the market that are designed specifically for buildings that have been approved. So with a bit of luck, we'll try and get them out. You know, they'll be able to sort of sell and move up the housing ladder as soon as possible. So from my perspective, it is a bit of a passion point and something I like to, you know, just provide reassurance to each and every one of the stakeholders within the building that we're remediating.
Yeah. Well, I think that's great. But going back slightly to the Cladding Safety Scheme, which was mentioned, it was previously known, you know, the Building Safety Fund. It's gone to the Cladding Safety Scheme. What's fundamentally changed in that, and why does it matter ultimately to clients?
So I think the Building Safety Fund was rolled out in 2020, Jodie, and it was to look at buildings above 18 metres in height. So very high risk buildings. And then in 2023, the CSS was launched, and that basically captures buildings anything above 11 metres. So obviously that casts the net a lot wider in terms of buildings that could potentially be eligible for funding. And I think the CSS was a much more efficient and a faster way of processing decision making. And I think in terms of the implications for the clients, although the CSS system is much faster and more efficient, what it does do is kind of presents a bit more responsibility in terms of clients and their advisors providing really clear, accurate, complete and well-structured submissions. So there is a bit more of an onus on the clients under the CSS, even though it's a far more efficient process.
Steve, can I jump in there? And because, you know, DALA, yourselves have described the whole portal and processes around the CSS as a conveyor belt. And my question to you is this a compliment? I ask because often, you know, I'll call block management a conveyor belt of problems, and I might swear instead of the word problems. That's kind of relentlessly chucking stuff at you, which is hardly complimentary. But is the CSS portal and processes an efficient conveyor belt? Is it a compliment to describe it that way?
I think it is a compliment. I think credit to the CSS, they have learned lessons from the BSF, which could have been quite clunky in terms of decision making. There was lots of delays. Projects were taking a huge amount of time to get, definitive decisions on funding and progressing the applications forwards. I think the CSS have done a really good job of learning lessons and streamlining that process. So I think, yeah, it definitely is a compliment. I'm sure Phil's got some experience with the portal, but
Yeah, so just thanks, Steve. Just to jump in there, I've got nothing but high praise for the Cladding Safety Scheme. I'd echo Steve's words that the Building Safety Fund, when it first launched, I remember going to a seminar run by the GLA, the Greater London Authority, who administer the BSF inside London, and they explained that it was almost like they were building the airplane as it was taking off the runway, and hence why there was certain communication gaps or long leads in terms of reporting and providing accurate and timely decisions. The Cladding Safety Scheme is a breath of fresh air to work with. In terms of decision making, Steve, we look at that project back in that we're working on in Brighton. We submitted the full works and cost submission in first week of January. They turned around 4 projects, decision making, totaling circa £22 million of funding within 7 days, which is a phenomenal turnaround. Even having worked previously in a development role years ago, to get funding from a private bank, you wouldn't get it turned around in 7 days. Speaking from experience of doing monthly drawdown. So Archway, I'm a chartered surveyor by trade, sort of circa 15 years experience. Archway is regulated by the RICS and we're insured to hold client funds. So what we do is, as part of a sort of working with the RTM, one of the angles and one of probably the unique selling points that we have is we have a banking facility that allows us to set up trust accounts for each project. And we can also, administer that. And as one of the problems, say, for an RTM is the likes of that project in Brighton is where we have, payment runs of circa £300,000-400,000 a month. For an RTM to administer that is cumbersome, and probably it would impede the progress of the project. What I'm saying is getting back to the slickness of the Cladding Safety Scheme is we submit our drawdowns on the 1st of every month. They're approved within 24 hours, and Archway are in funds for the various projects by the 8th or 9th, which creates a very harmonious project relationship between the professional team and the main contractor. Everybody's paid on time, and really it needs that efficiency, that sort of practical management of the whole portal to ensure the projects run smoothly.
I think that's a good point. And I think, going back to what Phil was saying about the speed of decision making, I think using that project example in Brighton, I think the only reason the decision making was so fluid there was because of the robustness and the completeness of the submission that we presented in collaboration. So part of that is the technical aspect. So building a really good, robust cost submission for the whole project in terms of the tender process. And then the other side of that is the process that Phil's explained nicely there in terms of processing that through the portal and reporting that to the CSS for funding and approval.
So in terms of a good submission then, is that what you just explained? It's going through a lot quicker. What would a problematic one look like?
I think a problematic one would be perhaps where the time isn't taken at the front end by the lead consultant team in terms of putting a really robust pack of specification and tender documentation together. Because what happens then is that manifests in gaps in the costs. So what you end up seeing is, if the tender pack is not tight, you end up seeing a lot of what we call provisional sums, which are kind of allocated figures, which are maybe more, maybe less kind of scenario, which the CSS obviously don't want to see in their submissions, because that rings alarm bells. there's no cost surety, and it kind of opens up exposure to risk in terms of delays, variations, etc., etc. So I think the more work that's done by the technical team at the front end to make sure that that tender process is tight and robust, that feeds into a really quality submission in terms of the cost upload and the approval process.
Great.
Can I just ask a question about the kind of the end users, the RMCs and the RTMs, and really to both Steve and Phil, how realistic is it for an RMC or RTM company to navigate the CSS process without a specialist team?
So if I'll jump in there if you don't mind, Stephen, I'll probably hand over to you after that. So the problem is for an RTM is, they take on the directorship or they manage the RTM company, but they're also holding down 9-to-5 jobs, or they're also working full time. To try and manage this themselves, or even manage the process via their appointed management company or block manager, I think in my opinion, elongates the whole process probably by about 50%. The benefit of using the Archway DALA model, you have a dedicated applicant rep in myself. DALA have got their supply network in terms of their lead consultancy role they're able to manage. So it's a seamless transition from inception right through to project completion. The great thing about that also is that Archway are a separate company to DALA. So I'm very much working on behalf of the RTM, albeit I'm working in partnership with DALA, but I sit the client side or the RTM side of the fence.
Got it, Phil. But can't a managing agent do that job on behalf of the principal accountable person, which is the RMC or RTM in most cases?
They probably could, yeah. There's no reason to say they couldn't. But it's also like saying that the RTM that the block manager could also perform some of the project management elements of the job, along with doing everything else that they're supposed to do. What I would say is everybody's got a key role within this facade remediation wheel, and the block managers work in tandem or hand in glove with myself in terms of various management issues that we need their input and expertise throughout the project. And for that, there is a fee that is payable via the Cladding Safety Scheme. But to answer your question, Jonathan, for them to take over what is essentially the management of the whole project, in my opinion, yes, it could be done, but I think it would take at least 50% longer to complete. It wouldn't be as efficient because they're dealing with the management of their building and of a wider portfolio.
Managing agents have got enough to do anyway by taking on more burden, unnecessarily, as Jodie and I only noticed.
Jump in there as well. A lot of this information is quite technical information. I'm lucky that I come from a project background, so I'm au fait with the process, I'm au fait with the tendering process, I'm au fait with drawing down money. To add that to a block manager's plate while they're probably managing several hundred other buildings, I think would be an unfair ask. But then, I don't know, maybe, I'm not too sure. But Steve, I'll hand over to you. Maybe you want to jump in there as well?
Yeah, I think I agree with Phil. I think what we're dealing with here is, let's not forget, is pretty complex construction projects. So, why wouldn't you be leaning on teams and professionals with specialist skills in developing and delivering these projects? Because it's what we do day in, day out, right? So the funding exists to enable RMCs, RTMs, property managers, principal accountable people. The fund exists to help those guys with the support and the level of experience and expertise they need to deliver an efficient project. So I think in utilising the skills that are available and the funding that's available, I think that's in everybody's benefit, because let's not forget the key focus that we're discussing here is critical life saving of the people in the buildings. So the efficiency and the compliance of the delivery is absolute paramount, I think.
Right, the whole sort of the portal process of, and have you seen where sort of self-managed properties or those under supported buildings typically come unstuck with that process?
So I'll jump in there by saying that, I have a monthly meeting with the Cladding Safety Scheme, and that's with a couple of directors and a couple of case officers to review the current progress of projects. So at present, going back to the launch of the Cladding Safety Scheme in 2023 to where it is now, it's becoming, the portal in itself and the reporting process is becoming month on month more robust. So the Cladding Safety Scheme are asking for more and more, which they very much, it's a key performance indicator for them. They want to ensure that there's delivery of timely and accurate information relating to program, cost, compliance. The feedback I've had from some of the cladding safety schemes is, during my meetings, is that, at times there can be breaks in the communication, gaps in the information, which makes their role harder. It makes the portal harder to manage, and it ultimately elongates the decision making. So, in terms of where I see the portal in 6 or 8 months' time or a year's time, it's going to be even more rigorous in terms of reporting.
I think another important factor to consider as well is that the principal accountable people on these blocks have to sign into the grant funding agreement. So there's an obligation there that they are delivering and putting the right professional teams in place to make sure that these submissions are accurate, robust, well structured and complete. And it's only when you get those compliant submissions that you get a nice, smooth running, efficient process from start to finish. So there is a contractual obligation for the clients to make sure that this is done properly. So again, why wouldn't you lean on specialist help there if the funding's available to deliver it for you?
But it very much sounds like you don't really have the choice. And a fundamental difference between the Building Safety Fund, the CSS is geared up to needing specialists to work with it. They can deliver their end of the bargain if they're dealing with competent professionals such as yourselves. That is perfectly clear, even if you have a managing agent managing your building. Yeah.
And it's also peace of mind, isn't it? I mean, it's great to be part of a team that know what they're doing ultimately, isn't it? And why take the burden of the stress and the anxiety of being in a complex process that you're not really comfortable with when, like I say, the help's available.
Yeah, certainly if the funding's available, because I think the biggest issue that leaseholders have is, how are we going to pay for this? So the fact that you're already paying your managing agent, and if your managing agent needs then to outsource to do X, Y, and Z, then where's that money going to be coming from? So if there is a funding option for that, you're getting the best of both worlds, really. But what would you say, from your experience of this whole thing, is the single biggest mistake that leaseholder-led boards tend to make at the start of these projects?
It's a good question, Jodie. I think the biggest mistake is that they get overwhelmed, and it's not an intentional mistake. I think they get overwhelmed by the significance of the size of the hurdles in front of them that they have to jump, and that there's a tendency to bury their head in the sand because the enormity of what's ahead of them frightens people. So your whole life is, and your net worth is in a flat, and suddenly the flat is for the time that it's got the B2 rating is almost worthless. You're trying to deal with the pressures of home life, family life, job, career, and suddenly then you get this devastating news, which is, your building's up, cladding issues, and how do you move forward? What I tend to see is I'll get an FRAEW report that was done maybe 6, 8, 10 months ago, and it's just sat in somebody's email while the RTM sort of didn't really know where to go. So yeah, that's probably one of the biggest mistakes, and again, not intentionally, that I come across my end. I suppose, Steve, in terms of the driving the program, the tender.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Phil, that you brought up there, because I think the guidance that a lot of RMCs and RTMs get initially is that they've got 3 months after they get funding approval to appoint their consultant team. So for me, that's kind of dead time, because you've got a FRAE report, your building needs remediation. And like Phil says, sometimes there can be a little bit of reluctance to engage with professional teams. But my advice would be to just reach out. We're all pretty friendly guys. We're here, we're experienced, we know what we're doing. Start having conversations. As soon as you've got your FRAE report, you've got an issue on the building, ring a few consultants, get a feel for them. Could you work with these guys? Are they saying the right things? And I think also, have a chat about their lead-in times. I've heard some horror stories about FRAE reports not being available for 16 weeks, for example. We at present we're delivering them in less than 4. So there is a kind of spectrum of what can and can't be delivered. It's a resource issue across the industry with a limited pool of experienced people.
Steve, as well as the resource issue, it's a lack of knowledge issue. So, there'll be RMC and RTM directors watching this podcast, and, they might be oblivious before the podcast that such companies existed to hold their hands through the process. You don't know what you don't know. So, going through the milestones at the beginning, one of the thoughts that really struck me was we really need flowcharts to be, really pushed out to leaseholder groups on as many forums as possible, so they can see actually it is complex. There are lots of stages. You need specialists, but there are people here to help you. You're not on your own. And if your managing agent, which you may, love to death, maybe they don't have the expertise, and most won't have the expertise to deal with such a complicated project. So it's knowing you exist in the first place, which hopefully is where people like me come in to do those sorts of introductions.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I say, it's all about leaning into the specialist help that's available out there. And it's not about kind of squeezing property managers out of the process. We want them fully engaged, and there's absolutely a big part and a role that they play. And Phil's mentioned earlier that's captured, their input in that process is captured in the fees that we get eligibility for as well. But it's more about building a collaborative project team. So that's, a relationship between the RMC, the RTM, your property managers, your applicant's representative, and your lead consultant team. If you get all those cogs working together and collaborating well, then your project's going to move efficiently, and it's going to be very stress-free for the RTM and RMC.
Great.
Yeah. So can you explain then the responsibility split between DALA Group and Archway? Where's the connection? Where did this all begin? This lovely relationship.
So I'll jump in there, Jody. So if we use sort of those 4 buildings that we're currently on site in Brighton as probably our sort of case study, just to discuss it. I knew of Steve and Dorian and Adam at their previous jobs, and the building in Brighton sort of came across my desk through an inquiry. We made the application in June last year. At that point, Steve and Adam were working with their own partnership. They came on board in July. And as I said, we worked through the whole funding mechanism and started on site in March. There was a very good synergy amongst us. I think that's right in saying that, Steve, that we all worked very, very, it was probably one of the best projects I've ever worked on and are working on at the minute. One of the great things was that my role was very client focused, applicant rep, getting the funding in place. And it was very easy to work sort of hand in glove with Steve and Adam, who sort of really sort of marshaled and drove the sort of coordination of the consultant team right through to tender and right through to delivery of full works and costs. I suppose we started to pick up a bit of synergy then in sort of October, November, when we realized that it was going, as well as we'd hoped. We were hitting all our milestones in terms of the key performance indicators with the Cladding Safety Scheme, our sort of fortnightly project meetings as a project team. We were way ahead of where we were on our original program. We sort of said that, look, there may be something more in this in terms of, we don't think there are too many sort of product offerings similar to what we can do. And that led to a sort of broader conversation. I suppose, Steve, do you want to jump in and then sort of the DALA introduction?
Yeah, definitely. I think, as Phil said, it kind of evolved into a really streamlined process, and we kind of recognized that actually we had something to offer here in terms of improving the efficiency of delivery. And I think whilst we're kind of independent businesses, we've both got our own independent responsibility through the process. We work collaboratively really well in a kind of shared responsibility kind of manner, if you like. And I don't think that starts and ends with Archway do this, DALA do that. It's a collaboration that works right through the whole process from start to finish. And I think that's why it works so well. We lean on each other's areas of expertise at the right moment in time. We collaborate well, communicate really efficiently. And then what that does is that manifests into clear and accurate communication back to leaseholders and clients and RTMs as well, because we're working as a team basically. And I think it works really well.
Yeah, I think that collaborative approach is really important, and especially if you bring the managing agent into that as well.
Yeah.
You've said earlier about, ultimately the managing agent would be outsourcing to you, and to Archway as well, through the schemes and that sort of thing. But actually, when it comes down to that collaborative approach, and the managing agent's obviously got the relationship in theory with the leaseholders and the people who live in the building, residents in general. So you would expect then the managing agent to maybe support more with the communication and the resident engagement strategies across, what you guys are doing. You're doing the very technical stuff, and the building management side of it, and then bringing the collaborative approach in with the managing agent as well to, to emphasize everything that you're doing and that you're all there to support each other.
Absolutely. And we support the managing agent. So, there's quite a technical process that's evolving and progressing. So we would then support the management agent with the right communication at the right time at the project and accurate information, because, ultimately it's incredibly frustrating, isn't it, when the managing agent is engaging with leaseholders and telling them X, and then the project team go and deliver Y, and then it's the poorer managing agent that takes the brunt of the frustration. So that's the situation that Phil and I try to avoid. And we work really hard and diligently to try and make sure that the property manager's part of that process right from start to finish, and that they've got, all the information they need to manage and do their job effectively as well.
Yeah, definitely. And you said about managing agents they can do a bit, but keeping everybody in the loop is really great. But where exactly is the line, do you think, between what's possible for the managing agent to do and what's maybe more advisable for the managing agent to do? Let you get on with your job, really.
There's a great old saying that I always say is like, you should stick to your knitting. And I mean that in the nicest possible way. It's like where the managing agent is there to sort of manage the building, make sure that, you know, the building runs smoothly, compliantly during the facade remediation process. So from their perspective, they have enough sort of statutory compliance issues within a normal building to manage, you know, the fire risk assessments, ECIRs, you know, PAT testing, all that sort of stuff. They need to manage that. Where we come in is we look after the very specific facade remediation to make sure we get the building compliant. You know, as I said, it's a very hand in glove relationship. And what I would always advise is, you know, block managers have more than enough plates to spin, where we can sort of take some of that load off their plates. We're very well positioned to do so.
That for me is coming across loud and clear. Could we talk about, you know, perhaps one of the elephants in the room? Anyone that hasn't gone through a process like this may not realise that we're talking about multi-million-pound contracts. We're not talking about, you know, 100 grand ex-dex. We're talking multi-million. So two quick questions. Where does the financial risk actually sit during a CSS-funded project? And should the leaseholders be nervous about financial exposure at any stage?
I think the main financial risk obviously sits with the funder, which is the government CSS fund. And I think what a good lead consultant does is sits himself in between the client and the fund and protects the client's interests as well as the fund's interests. So we, through our chartered professional teams, will make sure that valuations are accurate, that tender costs are accurate, that, you know, costs are being absolutely scrutinised and managed the whole way through that process. So the fund exists to protect leaseholders from the burden of having any costs associated to what, you know, let's be honest, is an industry-wide failing, unfortunately, isn't it, across the UK? So the financial risk, that the fund exists to prevent that financial risk and burden falling on the leaseholders. So, and that's what a good consultant team will provide basically for the clients.
Okay. And are there any protections in place to ensure, certainly from the contractor's point of view, to make sure that the contractors are paid correctly, but obviously from a leaseholder's or the fund's perspective, that they're not paid too prematurely, that they actually have done the job they're supposed to be doing? Where does that role sit with what you guys do?
So that sits with DALA projects, and we would have, you know, very experienced teams of project managers and quantity surveyors that will be visiting and managing the construction process from start to finish. So the way it generally works is the main contractor that's carrying out the work would submit a monthly valuation, and our quantity surveying team would go down, analyse the work that's being conducted, make sure their valuation is accurate. And then myself and Phil will lead progress meetings with the main contractor to discuss any on-site issues, problems with leaseholder engagement, anything that can have an effect on the way the building's being managed. And then obviously, once those valuations are agreed and signed off, we would then certify them via a grant, what's called a grant certifying officer. So they have to put their professional credibility on the line basically by signing a certificate, which then Phil would then process with a nice accurate submission to the CSS for a monthly drawdown payment. And it's that monthly drawdown payment that would protect not only the client, because they've obviously got a contractual obligation to pay the contractors, but it also protects the contractors because that's their payment on a monthly basis, basically. So we just work right through the process in that fashion.
And just to jump in sort of on the financial modelling, just to add sort of to what Steve has just said there, both DALA and Archway, we basically have a cash flow model that allows us to detail the whole cost of the job. It reflects the programme. It shows us our exact cash position at PC throughout the project. So, you know, at no point have is the client or the government at any financial risk. We can tell you exactly where we are, where the project will sit, if there'll be a small surplus, if there's unspent contingency, etc., etc. So we take that aspect, and I think that's it. Probably, that is a key, especially for a leaseholder sitting in there. And, as you quite rightly said, Jonathan, we're talking about projects of, especially that one in Brighton, which is 24 million pounds of funding across 4 blocks. So, we're not talking about a small pot of money here. So it is, the fiduciary responsibility weighs heavily on us, but we do work extremely hard to make sure that the reporting is accurate, that we know that we're not, the QS team down at DALA are making sure that, there's no, that the valuations are correct and accurate, and that information goes back up to the forecasting with the Cladding Safety Scheme.
And I think that shines a light on the importance of the collaborative partnership as well, doesn't it? Because if you've got a misaligned team of consultants there that are not quite on the same page, then that process that Phil and I have just explained there can be quite clunky, can cause problems if there's holes in the submissions, if the financial information that the lead consultants provide in the applicant's rep is not 100% accurate, then that's going to be, a pretty poor submission for a cost drawdown. But also, like Phil said, that continual management of the cost forecasting, and that's adjusted month on month, isn't it, Phil? So, you might have this month, we might have forecast X amount as a cost. Well, actually, we progressed really well, so we spent a little bit more. So then we need to realign our cost forecast as we go along so that the fund can monitor what's being drawn down and what's likely to come over the horizon. So it's really important to get that collaboration working nicely, I think.
That fund is held with you, is it, Phil? That doesn't fall into the managing agent's service charge.
No, that sits with me. Yeah. So that probably is, having experience of dealing with these kind of projects. We've got a financial model that really is bespoke to these Cladding Safety Scheme projects. So it really, that's what I would say. It's a much broader responsibility than, say, the service charge, which deals specifically with the building, whereas the financial model and the reporting is specifically for a Cladding Safety Scheme. But however, I do send a copy to all the RTMs that I work with on a at a month-end basis, simply so they can have sort of comfort and oversight of what's expenditure is against the original budget.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking, the last thing you need is, an accounts team who knows nothing of the building, just has this pot of money, and then you end up with the gardening and cleaning being pulled out of the fund or something. It's just, I could just imagine the headache of unpicking all of that at the year end.
Yeah. Precisely. And there's a contract obligation, so the clients need to sign into a JCT design and build contract with the main contractor. So there's a contractual obligation to pay the contractor on time. So it's really important that process is ticking over nicely and efficiently, because ultimately it's there to protect the client.
Yeah. And speaking of contractors as well, you've mentioned you do your due diligence, particularly robust, in a particularly robust way. What does that look like? I presume we're talking about, the contractors who are physically working on the building rather than, the ones that are overseeing it.
Yeah.
How do you find the right people for the right task?
So we actually put a hell of a lot of work into developing a really strong supply chain of main contractors. And when a contractor shows interest, or we show interest in a contractor, we will initially send them a pre-qualifying pack of information, which then collates all the information that we can need, everything from competencies of their professional team right through to financial standing, credit situation, the SCEB information, which is skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours, which demonstrates their ability and their competency to work on high-risk buildings. We look at case studies. What we like to see is that the contractors that we bring on board are specialist main contractors as opposed to subcontractors, because they've got the specialist experience in managing the health and safety aspect of a large project. But also you do need to be careful because as the sector kind of gains momentum, there are some more generalistic contractors, should we say, that might see an opportunity to win work in the sector. Now, some of those contractors can prove to be pretty good and establish quite a good reputation, but we choose to go with absolute specialists in their field, people that do these projects day in, day out, because ultimately we don't need to take the risk. We've got a pool of very specialist contractors that are exceptional at what they do. Leaseholder engagement is at the forefront of everything they do. We analyze what their management of leaseholder engagement looks like, and we just make sure that the projects are suitable. Sorry, the main contractors are suitable for that specific project.
So Steve, I think we're going to come to a resident engagement because that's a really important area. But what are the red flags when assessing a contractor for, a multi-million-pound cladding remediation project?
I think obviously financial standing is a huge one. We need to protect the client's interest and the government fund by not progressing with contractors that are under, can be seen as any financial risk. So we'll do a financial credit check on everyone that we use. We'll look at, cash flow of the business, their kind of turnover, make sure they're substantial enough to kind of deliver the value of contracts that we're talking about here. We also look closely at case studies. That's a really good indicator. If a contractor's got some really good case studies of like-for-like projects, that's also useful. In terms of red flags, if they haven't got any remediation sector experience, then obviously that's a red flag straight off the bat.
At the same time, Steve, of course, they can't gain any experience until they've had their first cladding remediation job awarded to them.
That is true. And I do feel for some of the guys that are trying to break into the sector, but we're very fortunate that we have a supply chain of specialist contractors. So as I was saying before, it's kind of, we're in a fortunate position where we don't have to take a risk. We don't have to take a risk on a contractor that hasn't got experience in the sector because we've got a pool of contractors that are sat there that have.
Yeah. And I think that the natural response when you go out to tender is that you potentially want to go for the lowest price. And I think that's, across the board from anything from, your gardening contract, external decoration to what you guys do. But do you ever walk away from the lowest tender? And how do you justify that to the CSS?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And yes, we do is the answer, because the cheapest price is not always the best option. Again, going back to the key focus of why we're discussing this today is it's regarding life critical safety work. So compliance and quality is ahead of everything that we do. It has to be the prime focus, because that's why we're in this situation, because buildings weren't put together correctly in the first place. So compliance and quality is really important, but also, we're causing a hell of a lot of disruption to the leaseholders in the building. So things like program management, leaseholder engagement management, all these kind of factors go into the decision that's made on which contractor is going to be best suited to deliver the contract. So it's not just about price.
So Steve, in terms of program, if the program was half the length but also double the price, that's probably an extreme example, you can still make justification to the CSS to go for the faster program rather than the least expensive program, because ultimately you want to get the building safe as quickly as possible.
There's a value point, right? So we have to obviously protect the funds as well. So we've got an obligation to protect the government funds because that's what we do. So we have to find that value point in the market, which is why we go to a competitive tender.
Yeah.
But yes, certainly program is a key factor in our decision-making process, absolutely. But also it's to do with the competency. Quite often you can tell when you get tenders received, you can tell if a contractor hasn't planned that process effectively as another contractor. So going back to what we discussed earlier about provisional sums, if you see a tender come back with lots of provisional sums, it's kind of hasn't been really given the attention that another contractor that has ironed out and mitigated all the risk of provisional sums. So you kind of get a good feeling that maybe this contractor's put a bit more thought and attention into planning this. Because quite often the lowest contractor will be full of holes in terms of their tenders. So it might start off as the lowest price, but by the time you get through to finalising all these provisional costs, it might be more expensive.
Yeah, I've seen that so many times as a managing agent as well, that the cheapest price or the lowest price never ends up that way, and then it just causes more of a headache. So it's great that you've got those skills that you can spot that right at the beginning. And as you say, put that work into it right at the beginning, so you can protect everybody involved.
Yeah, because generally the tender process in construction is a bit of a race to the bottom scenario, isn't it? Where in the wider construction industry, generally the lowest price wins the tender because it's all about margin. But this is not about margin, it's about life safety. So it's about doing these projects correctly and making sure that the quality is achieved and the compliance above all else is fully in focus at all times.
Yeah. Well, you don't want to end up back in the same position in 10 years' time, do you, really?
Exactly,
You've chosen the cheapest contractor now to potentially get it done. Flipping your example, Jonathan, somebody might say I can get it done in 4 weeks, and I'm going to be cheaper than the rest, but actually that means that they've cut corners, and in 10 years' time you're going to be remediating again, but potentially without that funding, possibly.
Or sooner. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's worth noting they do have to be competitive as well, and that's where our expertise as a lead consultant comes in, is finding that value point between compliance, quality, cost, management, leaseholder engagement. There's a lot of factors that go into making the decision. We're very careful about the contractors we use.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of resident engagement, then these projects can last a really long time. So what does resident engagement, or what does good resident engagement, I should say, you touched on it earlier, Phil, but what does that experience look like to you?
I think responsiveness is key. So generally, as a standard, as a minimum, the Cladding Safety Scheme require a newsletter or a leaseholder update once a month. As I touched on earlier, what the approach we take is we hold a fortnightly Teams if the leaseholders would like it, or the RTM. Generally, most of the RTM directors take me up on that, and then we do a wider newsletter on a monthly basis throughout the project to all the leaseholders and occupants or residents within the particular block. What does it look like throughout the project? It peaks and troughs, put it like that. So the early days of the eligibility, you're coming with some good news. It's a good news story. When we start to put up some scaffolding and people's balconies are being restricted, or it tends to become a little bit more challenging. But that's where we, together with the contractor and Steve and the DALA team, we sort of double down on that. We provide it, we explain why we have to do it. We explain the benefits that, if we can sort of have a coordinated work approach, we can get that section of works done quicker. It allows then the balcony to be released back to the resident or the leaseholder for continued use. And then ultimately, when we get to the project and you're sending it, you're circulating the confirmed project completion date together with the new EWS1. Again, we're back to that good news story. But yeah, to sort of answer your question, Jody, it's about continuous open communication. I'm quite a direct guy, which I find quite refreshing, and I think leaseholders and residents find it as well. We don't tend to hide behind anything. We explain the situation, we explain the issue, we explain the solution, and we tell them how long it's going to take.
One area, I suppose, of the residents get quite upset about is where they don't see many people on site and they think nothing's happening. So I suppose, that communication levels need to also cover that off. Nobody really wants to be bombarded with residents saying, I can't see anyone. Is anything happening? How many more years of this do we need to endure?
So, one of the projects that Phil and I are delivering as part of our portfolio, the contractor's actually got a full-time resident liaison manager as part of their project team. So it's a friendly face that is a full-time member of their project team that's solely responsible and focused on making sure that the leaseholders are engaged with, and that the project team is absolutely focused on making that process as less disruption as possible through that whole process, basically. And it works really well because they got a single point of contact. If there's any concerns, any questions, any queries, there's a friendly face and it can be resolved really quickly, and they can get the information they need. So small steps like that can go a long way.
Yeah. Are there any common communication failures that you're aware of that tends to cause friction? And you mentioned earlier, Phil, about restricting people's balconies, and I think we're in the era now of a lot of people work from home. You don't want the noise, you don't want the disruption. You might have a new family, a baby sleeping at home. I remember actually when I'd first had my daughter, and it was coming up to Halloween, I put a sign on the door saying nobody knock, please, because I didn't want her woken up. But you've got all of that going on. You've got people's lives that are being affected by this. So are there any sort of common failures there around communication that you tend to get complaints about?
I'll tell you, one of the classic ones is that as a construction industry, acronyms are used quite a lot. And you take for granted that when you write something, even something as like Cladding Safety Scheme, and you shorten it in some correspondence to CSS or JCT. Steve and I worked in this game a long time. So, we take for granted that people know that what we're explaining. So that's one. The sort of practical things that you're mentioning about, people working from home. That is sort of the common questions we have prior to, once we get our full works and cost approval. What we then do is we sit down in person with leaseholders and residents within the building to have basically an open forum, a contractor meet and greet. And the two questions that get raised all the time is, how long is the scaffolding going to be up and how noisy are going to be the works? So what we like to do is have a very detailed program. And, the way most of these cladding jobs work, it's a top-down remediation process. Thankfully, that most of the contractors that I've worked with use hand tools. So there's no heavy plant or machinery used to deconstruct the facade and install the new facade. So, there's no point sugarcoating it. The scaffolding is generally up for the whole entirety of the project. What we do is we make it, where we can, we'll offer privacy film. We'll, where a resident will say that they've got a very important meeting at such a time. We try to be as flexible and accommodating as possible. But, some of the communication fails are that, where a tenant or a resident hasn't sort of made us aware of particular needs, we don't know that we should be accommodating. But where a tenant or a resident or leaseholder has been very clear and precise on what they need, we do our best to meet that.
So the loss of light is obviously a major concern with the scaffolding up, and but there's also privacy as well. It's something you have to consider carefully when window cleaning, for instance. DALA's group MD mentioned to me one example of using one-way window film, which was akin to one-way glass in an interrogation room in a police drama. What other sort of small but impactful innovations do you see on site, or do you encourage on site?
I think you hit the nail on the head there. These steps don't have to be huge. They can be very small steps, but just with a bit of mindfulness can be very impactful. So say, for example, we've seen contractors use a no reply WhatsApp group. So using the work from home example, if they know they're going to be conducting some particularly noisy work in, outside one or two apartments for the next couple of days, just a simple WhatsApp message to the group can give that person in that residence the opportunity to say, okay, well, this is not ideal, but perhaps I need to make, alternative arrangements for my meeting tomorrow, for example. So small steps like that can go a really long way, really, and they're not that hard to roll out. It just needs a bit of thought and consideration.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of, or from your perspective, the resident engagement strategies, where does that sit? Who owns that, do you think? Should that be the contractor, the managing agent, you guys as lead consultant? We've spoken a lot about having a collaborative approach, but actually providing that information to the residents, where do you think that sits?
I suppose
Anyone?
I'm going to say that probably, well, actually, it's not probably, that would sit with me. But as you know, so I'd have it akin is it sits with me until we get to the main contract. And then, like Steve mentioned earlier, the project down in Brighton, the contractor has a dedicated full-time resident liaison officer. I actually have a weekly call with those guys, with the site manager and the RLO, to use another acronym. We have a call once a week for 15-20 minutes just to run through various minor issues that we can deal with as the sort of, minor issues that don't need to be raised in the main contract meeting once a month, that we can do little things. So, one of the feedback I had from that RTM last week when I met with them was that, the project information room in the building hasn't been updated. So the RLO needs to do that. That's something that we're going to raise today. It's again just so to answer your question, Jodie, sorry, is up to letting of the main contract, that would sit with me. Once it goes to the main contract and to PC, it sits with the contractor via the resident liaison officer, however, under my direction. So again, I don't pass the buck on, but by the same token, it's within their sort of tender award to fully update the residents and leaseholders during the works.
And therefore,
Yeah.
Steve, is your role in DALA more technical and less resident liaison related?
I wouldn't say less resident focused. I think ultimately there's a shared responsibility amongst the whole project team. So there'll be certain periods of the process. We're talking about a very long process here when you include pre-construction and construction phase.
Yeah.
So there'll be various points of that process where it's better suited for certain parties to take a lead on that engagement. So it might be the property manager at certain points, it might be the applicant's rep at certain points, it might be the lead consultant at certain points. I think the key thing is to get that collaboration working, because the information flow amongst those key parts of the project team are what's going to keep that communication moving, keep it up to date, keep it accurate. So I think it's really a case of collaborating through the process and helping each other out with that, really.
Yeah. And Jonathan, I'm not sure if you'll agree, from a managing agent's perspective, the natural way for a resident to communicate would be via the managing agent. So, I've said there, like where does the onus sit, if you like, or where should it be? But I think I would say probably 90% of the queries are going to come via the managing agent and then back out to the project team. So should it then sit with the managing agent to communicate out, do you think? I mean, Jonathan, that's probably a good question for you.
Yeah, well, I think the chaps have said that the managing agent involvement needs to be well defined, and their fees associated with the cladding remediation project needs to be recompensed via the fund. So that does need, so it shouldn't be a burden to the managing agent to receive queries that they might, otherwise, need to pass on to the contractor, because it's, contractually the contractor does need to do the resident engagement and have the resident liaison officer, the RLO, appointed, and DALA as lead consultant and employer's agent have a role in. So I think, the managing agent's role clearly needs to be well defined, so they're sticking to their lane. But inevitably, no matter what you write to a group of leaseholders, and no disrespect to any leaseholders listening, the natural course of action will be to contact the managing agent as the single point of contact, who will then help. So, so I would say yes, managing agent, be involved, make sure you're recompensed via the fund for your work, and do that job diligently.
And I think it's worth noting that the process, the hard work that Phil explained that Archway do in terms of setting up those regular engagement meetings and calls that are held, and the presentation with the contractors, introducing, the resident liaison officers to the leaseholders. If that's communicated effectively at the start of the project and managed correctly, then a clear communication channel can actually take a lot of that burden off the property manager, because actually then the leaseholders are aware that there is a resident liaison officer that I can contact directly for construction related queries, for example. And I have got an applicant's representative in Facade, in Archway Facade Management, that, I can contact with any queries as well. So there will be the odd one or two that are more comfortable dealing with the property manager, because that's who they've always dealt with in terms of, raising queries. But, a lot of that burden, if it's managed effectively, can be taken away from the property manager, which is what we're here to try and help with.
Yeah. And in terms of the project itself, then, when I've never done a project as big as what you're talking about, but if you're thinking about a standard external decoration project, for example, there tends to be a conversation around, well, whilst we've got the scaffolding up, why don't we check this, or why don't we check that? So do you find that there's a bit of a temptation to bundle other bits and pieces into the work that you're doing because scaffolding is already up? And when does that become smart planning, and when does it start to become a risk to the project?
It's a great question. It can be a very, very problematic scenario, particularly if you've got RMCs and RTMs that are not really that experienced in terms of pulling design packages for works together effectively, potentially. The CSS are very kind of black and white in that the fund that is there to exist with the remediation of the external wall work. So using the scaffold as an example that you mentioned there, Jody, let's say, for example, the building would like to replace windows. What the government will do is work out a percentage of the cost of that scaffold that needs to be attributed to that window installation. What's also important to be mindful of is, windows will carry a long lead-in time. There's a design element to it. There's a cost element. All of those will sit outside of the contract. So what you don't want to do is to dig yourself into a hole where you're contractually exposing the client on the external wall remediation project because your window manufacturer is 8 weeks in delay or something like that. So it's very, very difficult to amalgamate the two. So what my suggestion would be, unless there's a clear defined package with funding available to pay for that package and a clear specification, prior to the remediation project progressing in terms of the tender process, so well in advance of actually work starting on site, then it's probably, my advice would be to kind of separate the two.
Because those works will also, if it's an HRB, those works will require gateway approval as well.
Absolutely.
And the funding issue you raise is critically important. You don't want to hear that the window replacement project is going to happen at the same time and funding will arrive in stages, and it's probably a recipe for disaster, but it's inevitable that an RMC or RTM will try and, as Jodie says, bundle bundle the works in. So if I suppose if it does happen, it needs to be very, very well planned. And if additional works are introduced late in the process, presumably you would probably discourage them very strongly because it could jeopardize the entire project.
Yeah. And that's not a case of being obstructive or not being helpful. That's actually a case of trying to protect the client's interest, because
Yes.
like I say, the last thing you want to do is to advise your client into a position where they're going to be exposed contractually because they're causing a delay on the contractor's project. So obviously funds, the costs attributable to all those delays are going to be huge. And let's not lose focus that we're trying to put life critical safety risks as a priority as quickly as possible. That's the nature of the work that we're trying to conduct here, not kind of building betterment as such.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll agree, Jonathan, that you can hear, I can imagine the conversations in resident meetings now of, oh, we've got some free scaffolding because it's being paid for, so we might as well
Yeah,
do X, Y, and Z. But it's great your point there that you've just made that, this is a very critical life-saving project that you're currently working on. And, it's as lovely as I'm sure it would be to be able to make the building better in other ways. Let's focus on what we're doing. But it's also
yeah,
educating the residents of that and being very clear with the communication around that. And that sounds like exactly what you do.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that's exactly what it's about, really, is just kind of managing the expectations from day one, really. But we do get the question, you're absolutely right, it's a burning question.
Yeah.
We get it all the time.
Yeah. And have you seen any projects delayed significantly because works have been popped in there a bit too late, or or discoveries have happened ultimately. You've taken something off the external wall, it's all been peeled back, and then you suddenly find something catastrophic behind there, which is delayed things. Have you seen that happen?
It's very rare because we take a lot of time to make sure that we mitigate out as much risk as possible on these projects, but we have seen it. There's an example of a project that we delivered in Bristol some time ago, and the external wall was taken apart, and then the structural frame that sat behind the external wall was, you know, awful, basically. There's no way that you could fit a new system to the facade. So that was back in the days of the Building Safety Fund. So the decision-making process took slightly longer. And I have to say, Homes England were fantastic in terms of accommodating the additional requirements, because generally the structural side of things isn't covered by the fund, so it can cause a little bit of a grey area. But our building surveying teams were able to work in collaboration with Homes England to protect the interest of the client. Even that in that extreme scenario, we worked together to protect the interest of the client to make sure that there was a huge delay. The costs spiraled slightly, but at the end of the day, we managed to get the job done in the end.
Right. And thinking about delays then, aside from building safety regulator approvals, what's the most common causes of delay for CSS funded projects?
In terms of the submission or the project in its entirety.
Both, I guess. If is there anything that comes along that tends to cause a delay? But let's talk about the project itself.
Yeah. In terms of the project itself, it normally boils down to variations, scope creep on the original main contractor's contract. But what we try and do is mitigate out as much risk as humanly possible. There's always going to be some variations on a big construction project. But what we do is we utilize something called a pre-contract service agreement before we go into the main contract with the contractor. And what that entails is basically probably about 10 to 12 weeks worth of intrusive inspections. So digging a little bit deeper than the FRAEW investigation, for example, just to make sure that things like the structure of the frame of the building doesn't hold any kind of complexities or unknowns. So we work really hard and diligently to try and mitigate out as much of those risks so that when we get into contract and we mobilize on site, we've got the best chance possible of having a smooth running process from start to finish. There's little variations, and that tends to manage out the risk of delay as much as possible.
Okay. And is poor quality information a major issue for you, even with the portal system?
In terms of the portal submission,
Yeah, portal submission, yeah.
I think generally, I think Phil will probably vouch for this, but when you upload a submission for approval for costs, the important thing is that there's, we touched on it earlier on, didn't we, about the trouble that can be caused if there's lots of provisional sums in costs. So that can elongate the decision-making process slightly in terms of getting submission approval and funding eligibility, because there's lots of unknown variables in there. So when the CSS look at that cost submission, they see it as not quite complete because there's a lot of variables that they can come unstuck on, and they'd much rather spend more time before your final cost submission to iron out and mitigate all those risks of variations as possible, so they know exactly what they're dealing with in terms of the costs.
Steve,
Okay.
where did disputes tend to arise on these projects, and how are they typically resolved?
I think in terms of contractual disputes in the construction phase,
Yeah.
in all honesty, they're very rare because of that robust process that we spoke about earlier. Getting to a stage where if you've got a good consultant team, a good lead consultant will position the client when they enter the contract that there's not really too many contestable items that can be discussed. There's not a great deal that can go wrong. We've explored the external wall. We know what we're building. We've had a good intrusive survey done, and we've taken the time to design it, with all the information we need on the building as it exists.
That's great, but disputes must have arisen in the past, and what is probably the most common dispute that arises, irrespective of who's at fault, but
I
what
think in
actually.
terms of contractual dispute, the only real one that I've dealt with in probably being engaged in over 100 of these remediation projects in recent years, is where a contractor has gone into administration mid-contract. That unfortunately happens in the construction industry. It's a very difficult situation to manage out of, very difficult situation to manage compliance-wise. So that's the logic behind the robust pre-qualification that we do with our contractors, because we want to try and avoid that at all costs, because that's a scenario that no project wants to be in, basically.
And do the lawyers come in right at the beginning to make sure the contracts are set up in such a way that they're watertight, everyone is properly aligned? Can any firm of solicitors deal with this type of legal support?
I think any so that's kind of that's quite a big area there, but using the point about any solicitors being involved, then they can be. But I think that if the legal team that's appointed is appointed that hasn't got specialist construction knowledge, that can cause problems and delays. But I would absolutely, particularly if a client's less experienced, for example, then I would, yes, definitely recommend that a legal representative is made just to cast their eyes over things like the JCT design and build contract, to negotiate any amendments that go into the contract that the client might wish to be protected with. So yeah, and there is funding as part of the eligibility process. There is funding available to get that legal representation as well.
And who brings in the legal support? Is that your responsibility? Is that Phil's?
Generally, I'll jump in there. So generally, with the RTMs, that they may have a solicitor, but it may be sort of a general practice solicitor. As part of my role, I have a small framework of solicitors that I use, and I'm happy to do an introductory call with the solicitor and the RTM. And if the RTM's happy to proceed with that solicitor, the solicitor will do the KYCs, the know your client sort of introductory role. And it does work quite well because the solicitors that I use have worked on numerous Cladding Safety Scheme projects, both under 18 metres and over 18 metres. So what we've done is we've prepared an agreed schedule of amendments standard amendments that we can roll out for buildings under 18 metres and then buildings that are over 18 metres, which capture the new gateway regime.
Yeah, great.
Okay, so who actually sits behind the Cladding Safety Scheme then? Are we dealing with civil servants, consultants, bit of both, some random people? How does it work? Who sits behind that?
So the Cladding Safety Scheme is a government funding initiative by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, MHCLG. So MHCLG will design the scheme in terms of from a policy standpoint. Homes England will then run the scheme as a delivery partner, and the CSS is the mechanism which is used to fund and deliver the remediation projects on eligible buildings.
Mm-hmm.
So there can be a mixture within that scenario. It's mainly civil servants in terms of government representation, but they do lean on specialist consultants such as Atkins Realis and people like that as well to kind of populate and feed into policy development.
Okay, and how aligned are you then with Homes England and the CSS team? How much does that relationship matter to you?
It's paramount. The CSS obviously administer the fund, and both Archway and DALA, are very keen to engage with the CSS throughout. I think the CSS have some frustrations in terms of consultant teams across the sector not being focused enough on KPI delivery. Phil mentioned the key KPI factors that the CSS work to, and on a below 18-metre building, for example, that's submitting full works and costs within 9 months of a PTS receipt. Pre-tender support. So basically the initial funding, pot of funding that a client will get given to enable the project to start mobilising. So it's 9 months from the initial receipt of that PTS money to full works and cost upload, so a final cost for the project, and then 11 months for a start on site. This is for a below 18-metre project. So the CSS have some frustrations in the sector with those KPIs not generally being delivered. So Archway and DALA work very closely together with a sole focus on delivering those CSS KPIs. And as Phil mentioned earlier, the projects in our portfolio currently sit between 12 and 16 weeks ahead of those KPIs, which we think is pretty sector leading. So that engagement with the CSS is absolutely essential.
Right. And from your interactions, then what does the CSS team actually want to see from applicants?
In terms of, they just want to see progress and action. In short, they the portal is set up to be proactive. They want, as I dwelled on earlier on, they want, accurate and timely reporting of information. In the event that there is a variation or a program slip, that they want to be informed of that as soon as possible. And generally, it's very progress driven in terms of, their key performance indicators. They're not shy about sharing them. They want to see action. They want to see delivery. They believe that and they're quite rightly so, that they've set up this portal. They've introduced the funding. It's about us as consultants and stakeholders within this delivery to just get on with it and progress with the facade remediation.
I think it's clear what separates a good remediation project from a great one, in terms of, a great project delivers technically and maintains a positive resident experience throughout. I think we've covered all that, really well. If you slightly out there, what would be your top 3 pieces of advice to an RMC or RTM board about to embark on this journey?
That's a really good question. I think my thought would be, any sort of pieces of advice would be, upon receipt of the FRAEW, look to form a working board. So, if you've got if the RTM is 5 people and you've got some leaseholders who are also heavily involved, I would form a working board so that they can make decisions on behalf of the rest of the leaseholders quite timely. Because what I find is it can become disjointed. But so that'll be some working group. I'd form a working group. The second would be to, what would you like to do? What is your preferred program? Do you want to get this done as soon as possible? Do you need to engage other stakeholders, or are you happy with, what is your sort of business plan to deliver the facade remediation? And the third one would be, how involved do you want to be? Do you want to be sitting pari passu with the likes of me, involved in weekly meetings, fortnightly meetings, site meetings, or are you happy to hand over the reins to myself and Steve? Let us deliver you a great project, and you can sit there almost as a director that we report into.
Right.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone so much. It's been a great conversation. I'm really grateful for you to come onto the podcast, and thanks so much for your time.
Brilliant.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jodie.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.